Essential and non-essential clauses. How are they tested on the digital SAT and what the heck are they? So for clauses, there are two types of clauses: necessary clauses and non-necessary clauses, or in other words, essential and non-essential clauses. Let's take a look at essential clauses first. So essential clauses are things that you have to have in the sentence for it to make sense, or else if you didn't have this, it would not work as a sentence. So for example, when the word who is coming after some type of noun or some type of phrase, we are being specific about that. So people who ride roller coasters love thrills. We are specifically talking about people that like roller coasters. If we took out that who part and made it a non-essential clause, then we would just be talking about people in general. When we use a period, a semicolon, or a colon, or even that, those are needed for the sentence to work. Now, if we look at non-essential clauses, these are things that if we took them out of the sentence would still make sense and work. When we do a comma who, the non-essential clause is something that adds a little bit more light on the subject that we're talking about. However, it can be taken out and the sentence will still work. We can put it at the end of the sentence. We can do a comma which, comma who. We can even start the non-essential clause with a comma and then end it with a comma. And that's one key that we can be on the lookout for to recognize if it's a non-essential clause or not. Also, if we decide to use dashes or parentheses or commas, we need to make sure that whatever we start with, we also end with. So we cannot mix and match. We can't use a comma and a dash, a colon and a dash, a parentheses and a dash, so on and so forth. Polyphenols or organic compounds blank among their many roles provide pigment that helps protect the plants against ultraviolet radiation from sunlight. All of these answer choices have the word that in it. And normally we would say, well, that shouldn't have a comma before or after. That's a misuse of a comma. However, if we look at the sentence above, we see that after roles, we have a comma, which immediately makes me think, okay, am I dealing with a non-essential clause here? And the way we can test that is we can put a comma before the word among and then completely take that section out and continue to read the sentence and see if it still makes sense. So polyphenols or organic compounds that provide pigment that helps protect plants against ultraviolet radiation from sunlight. That still works. So when we look at these answer choices, we see that this dash here does not work because we have the comma over here at the end. And remember, we can't mix and match. This semicolon here, that's the same thing as using a period for the purposes of the digital SAT. So polyphenols or organic compounds, that period, that doesn't make sense. So that is out. Then we have that with a colon. Again, we can't use that here because polyphenols or organic compounds, that is not a complete sentence on its own. And remember, when we use a colon, everything before the colon has to be a complete sentence. For that reason, D is out. Then we're left with C, that, comma, which again makes complete sense when we write it like that. And this becomes our non-essential clause, which means we can take it out and the rest of the sentence still works. So C is the answer. Photosynthesis, the mechanism by which plants use sunlight to turn carbon dioxide and water into blank, is fueled in part by an enzyme called photosystem 2 that harvests energy giving electrons from water molecules. Again, we know the word has to be nutrients, but let's take a look here. When we look at the beginning of the sentence, we see that after the word photosynthesis, we see a comma. So immediately I'm thinking, is this a non-essential clause situation? So I'm going to go ahead and circle that comma and say, okay, if I start with a comma, I need to end with a comma. So for that reason, D would be out because it has a dash at the end of it. And if we start a non-essential clause with a comma, we cannot end with a dash. It needs to be a comma. So right now I'm leaning towards C, but let's take a look at A. If I say photosynthesis, the mechanism by which plants use sunlight to turn carbon dioxide and water into nutrients is fueled, that doesn't really make sense. We start to get on to a run-on sentence. A is out. Same thing with and. And doesn't make sense for this sentence because again, we can end on with a run-on sentence, as well as plants are not using sunlight to turn water into nutrients and is fueled. They're not turning into is fueled. So and doesn't make sense there. And C, if you started with C, you would notice immediately that if we were to take out the part between the commas, so it's just photosynthesis is fueled in part by an enzyme called photosystem, it makes total sense. So we know immediately this is a non-essential clause. We need a comma at the end of nutrients, and C would be our answer. This last one deals with names and titles, so let's see how we would solve this problem. A recent study tracked the number of bee species present in 27 New York apple orchards over a 10-year period. Blank found that when wild growth near an orchard was cleared, the number of different bee species visiting the orchard decreased. So we have an entomologist, Heather Graff. Now when we're dealing with names and titles, it's just like a non-essential clause rule. If there are commas around the name, that means we can remove the name and the sentence will still work. So in this case, we're wanting to see, is her name an essential clause or a non-essential clause? And do we need commas around it or do we not? So let's take a look. So immediately I know that the colon will not work based on our colon rules. So we have B, entomologist Heather Grab. Well, in the sentence, am I talking about just an entomologist in general, or am I talking about a specific entomologist? In this case, I'm talking about a specific entomologist, which is Heather Grab. Entomologists found that when wild growth near an orchid was cleared, the number of different species visiting the orchid decreased. That wasn't just done by an entomologist, that was done by Heather Grab, who happens to be an entomologist. So B is out. Then if we look at D, we can't use a comma because this is not an introductory phrase. This is just a proper noun, entomologist Heather Grab. So we would not be using a comma in this case, so D would be out for that reason, which leaves us with C. Entomologist Heather Grab found that when wild growth, yada, 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 we want to point out that Heather Grab is an essential clause for this sentence because that's who we are specifically talking about that made this discovery. So C is the answer. So again, with essential and non-essential clauses, things you want to look out for are whatever I start the non-essential clause with, comma, parentheses, dash, I need to end with that. And most importantly, to see if it's a non-essential clause, I need to make sure I take it out of the sentence and see if the sentence still works. If it does, you're dealing with a non-essential clause. If the sentence does not work, you are dealing with an essential clause and you cannot surround it. All right, see you in the next video.